Welcome everyone to the Constructivist Meetup series. Today I have the deep honor to introduce Leslie Greenberg. Dr. Greenberg and I met about 7 minutes ago. However, even though this is the first time I've met him, he has always been at least one of my muses, kind of sitting on my shoulder and talking to me when I write things about psychotherapy. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think that his status and his achievements need any introduction. Nonetheless, it's helpful to do so. He is a professor at York University. He has received a suite of awards, not the least of which is the APA Award for Distinguished Professional Contributions to Applied Research. He's one of the founders of emotion-focused psychotherapy, and he adopts a dialectical constructivist theoretical framework. And the things that I, over the years, have appreciated so much about his work and that have always informed my thinking are, of course, first and foremost, the dialectical constructivist framework that focuses on meaning and relationships, which is a holistic integrative framework, which is really a holistic integrative framework, not a false one. It really is. His emotion-focused therapy, the importance that it was been acknowledged for over 30 years of the role of emotion in structuring thought and action and social relationships, the importance of the relationship rather than mere techniques in fostering therapeutic change, the explicitly developmental approach in what he does. I remember a study which I thought was quite remarkable, in which it wasn't just the structure of thinking that was undergoing developmental change, but the actual movement of emotion from an undifferentiated state, multiple emotions undifferentiated and moving toward increasing differentiation and integration. I thought that that was, quite inspirational and rare in the study of psychotherapy. And of course, I think it is a theory that we can recognize ourselves in and use. So I'm delighted and very, very happy that he has agreed to talk with us. And he's going to talk to us very fittingly on working with emotion, a dialectical constructivist perspective. I turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll just add that I'm a retired professor, no longer professoring. So I will shift to a shared screen. Okay, I trust you can see the slide.
Yep.
Perfect.
So just as an overview, I'm going to discuss theory of functioning a little bit, then the role of emotion, language, and meaning. And I'll talk some about emotion schemes, because we're based on the notion of an emotion scheme, and then move to practice. And finally, the principle of changing emotion with emotion, which I see as a common principle to explain change. I guess other people should put their thing on mute, right? So firstly, what is innate? I think people come into the world with certain biases and preferences, very fundamental things like light versus dark, warm versus cold. I mean, they have that ability to discriminate. And they come into the world with an affect system which was evolved to promote survival. And they come into the world with a primitive, innate mental meaning-making system with specific characteristics and we have emotion schemes and cognitive schemes, which I will talk about. There's only one major motivation: to survive and to thrive. And everything emanates from all these fundamentals. So human beings are goal-directed, trying to understand and control in order to adapt, survive, and thrive. There are two general purpose processes that support this overall motive. And one is affect regulation. Human beings are organized to regulate their affect. Now, that doesn't mean down-regulate affect a la emotion management. It's really, we want to have the emotions that help us to survive and not have the emotions that indicate danger to our survival. So we're always trying to have the affects we want and not have the affect we don't want. We're also born to create meaning, which means we fundamentally make distinctions and create narratives. And the aim of these is also to adapt and survive. Our goals always, therefore, involve an affective component, expressing the organism's history or life experience. And affect is about appetite versus aversion, good or bad for me. And we also always include a cognitive component, which is a true or false, right or wrong. So essentially, we have the dialectical constructivist theory, which based on these two fundamental systems, an affective system, which is pre-symbolic. It talks to us through our body. So it's an intelligent language, but it talks to us through our body, and affect regulation is a general aim. And then we have a meaning construction process, which is symbolic, and the will to meaning is a general purpose process, right? And then we have the interaction between these two systems, and that's what determines experience. So when I'm working with someone sitting in front of me, I'm essentially working with their affect and the meaning they make. And a lot of the meaning is how they make sense of their affect. So I want to just show a little clip of this process. You might have to turn your sound up really high, because when you make little clips to embed in a PowerPoint, the sound goes down. So this is from a commercially available film, Dion, a woman who's depressed. And this is right at the beginning of the session. She's talking about her struggle.
To keep getting up and going to work.
Pushing and pushing, yeah. I wonder if you can breathe and, maybe even let the tears come if you're willing, or it's like you're struggling on the brink of them, but they're important tears. So there's the struggle of pushing and pushing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it just makes me tired, and I got my bachelor's degree.
If you were to speak from the tears.
So it's hard to see, and I'm having difficulty controlling the video, but I want you to watch that the organism is crying. A tear comes down, drops down from her eye. This is the affective organismic system.
If you were to speak from
There's the tear dropping. I don't know if my pointer comes up on your screen, but there's a tear dropping, right? So this is the organism. The organism is in pain, is hurting, but then look at what comes out of her mouth.
I got my bachelor's degree.
That's another system. It's a narrative, meaning-making system. And at this point, the two are disjunctive, right? They're incongruent. So my job is to try to bring the meaning-making system to the affect system. So I will say something like, if the tears could speak, what could they say? So I'm trying to integrate these two systems. I'll just run it back a little. There's the tear.
I got my bachelor's degree.
If you were to speak from the tears, or actually let them speak, what would they be saying? I feel
hopeless. I feel like I'm struggling, and
It's just like pushing.
So there we've brought the languaging system to the affect system. We're naming the feeling of hopelessness. And for me, this is a good thing, right? Even though it's a painful symptomatic emotion, we've now got her speaking from her actual lived experience, right? So moving back to talking, firstly, what is emotion, right? And this is a quick summary. Emotion's a complex state that results in physical and psychological changes that influence thought and behavior. This is one of the things that Michael said at the beginning, highlighting emotion as influencing thought and behavior. At its core, emotion is connected to survival, to our needs. It has an action tendency, it guides us to take action, and it sets a basic mode of processing in action. So actually, emotion is our fundamental meaning system in and of itself, because it's evaluating and giving us a kind of orientation to the world. So emotions are our primary meaning system. They give us information about our reaction to situations through our bodies. And then we have this affect regulation principle, which I've said, and in terms of time, I'm just going to summarize. But affect regulation is a major regulator of behavior. We do things in order to have certain affects. And most importantly, we seek relationships and we seek achievement or goal attainment because they give us certain good feelings or feelings that will help us aid goal attainment. So all I'm emphasizing here is we're not born, so to speak, with an actual attachment system. In my view, we're born with an emotion system, and emotion leads to attachment. So we construct attachment out of an emotion system. If we didn't have an emotion system, we wouldn't have attachment. If we didn't have an emotion system, we wouldn't have achievement. Then what is meaning? Well, organisms organize, and they organize by making sense of their experience of self, world, and other. Meaning is created by people as they experience new things and integrate new information. New experiences force reorganization and meaning making and create new ways of being. So narrative is the most important meaning-making device, but what's really important is to understand that knowing springs to life, according to Damasio, springs to life in the feeling of what happens when changes occur in our body, and these are connected to environmental impacts. So it's through storying affect that we come to know what's happened to us. First stories were constructed by pre-linguistic primitive human beings. I'm reading a book now called Being Human, talking about the Paleolithic age, right? And these people had meaning, but they didn't have language. So this is the very important thing, right? The first stories were constructed by pre-linguistic primitive people who coded experience into something like, you throw a stone at me, it hits my body and it hurts. So we have no language, but we still have this narrative. Meaning was created long before language. Experience is then organized into stories that have beginnings, middles, and ends, agents, actions, and intentions. So much meaning is pre-linguistic, and intentionality precedes the emergence of language. I have a 17-month-old granddaughter now, And she is full of meaning, and we communicate, and but she has no language. But she knows what she likes, what she doesn't like. She understands what we're saying. If we say, let's sing, I've forgotten what it is. Old MacDonald had a farm. She goes and she gets her book of Old MacDonald's and she brings it. This is all going on virtually. So she has lots of meaning and capacity for meaning, but she has no language. So language works inside a pre-existing context of nonverbal meaning. And semantic clarity in language depends on experiential non-linguistic processes. And experiential knowledge, therefore, refers to an implicit experiential meaning domain. Language is necessary to make the meaning explicit to the other and possibly to the self, but it's not the creator of meaning. Now, emotion is generated psychologically, most fundamentally, by automatic appraisal of situations in relation to needs, goals, and concerns. Right, we're just going to carry this definition. But what's important here is automatic appraisals are not in language. The amygdala reacts in 1/50th of a millisecond. Is this novel? Is this relevant? Is it good? And so on. All that goes on without language very rapidly, and that generates emotion. So this is old hat now, but basically from Ledoux, we know that if we see something out there that's snake-like, the information goes through the hypothalamus, and it goes twice as fast to the amygdala than it does to the visual cortex. The amygdala reacts with fight, flight, or freeze before we actually consciously see the snake, right? So it gives us a global apprehension of reality and a reaction to it. But not only does the information go down the brainstem, the amygdala reaction, the amygdala broadcasts forward to the prefrontal cortex. So by the time we consciously see the snake, we're already oriented towards it to analyze it in a particular way. So when we see the snake, we're oriented by our emotion system to ask, is this dangerous? And then we look at it, it's a cobra or it's a rattlesnake, and we integrate with our more sophisticated or more social learning, and we integrate head and heart to get a final response. But from this, we see that really emotion sets problems for reason to solve. Is this dangerous? Otherwise, if I saw the snake with Gilliam talking about food, I would ask, can I eat it? Or can I make love to it? Or can I play with it? All those would be very dangerous to my health, right? So the fact that by the time I see the snake, I'm already processing danger versus not danger is very important. So emotion sets the problem to solve. Is it dangerous? So in this way, we see that cognition works in the service of affective goals. So emotions are complex, dynamic, lived constructions. They're idiosyncratic. They depend on my life experience. And we develop emotion schemes, right? Emotion schemes, which are patterned mental organizations, and they serve as emotion schematic memories. They're action and experiencing producing structures. Right? This is going to be important. They're not thoughts or beliefs. They're action and experiencing producing structures. So a scheme is a pattern of mental organization. It's experience and action producing. It's a self-organizing process. It's not a thing. And it consists of components and elements linked together in a network. So essentially, a scheme is a neuronal network, right? And can you see my cursor when I move my cursor around?
Yeah.
So if we take this as a network, right? This gets activated and it produces an experience of, say, anger. But then what's important is to see that this network is potentiates and is connected to that network. And so where anger is, sadness may not be far behind, because there is an emotion process where when one emotion is activated, it activates other things around it without being mediated by language. So we work with an emotion system and we activate the emotion system. And the first law of emotion is one thing leads to another. And that's the kind of system we want to be able to enter. But to enter that, we have to have the emotion schemes activated, up and running, and then they induce a kind of emotional process. And then people make meaning of all of this. So schemes are units of meaning that are developed from our activity and experience in the world, right? They're situated, they contain expectancies, and they interpret our life world. So unlike associationistic notions of reinforcement notions, constructivist schemes are self-propelling. They're not stimulus-driven. They actually are trying to apply. Now, all this comes from a Piagetian framework. And schemes apply, multiple schemes apply, they co-determine performance, and they are cue activated, but under minimal activation. There's no such thing as a stimulus in the world. There are cues. Cues are constructed aspects of the stimulus situation. Like when a dog hears the bell ring, they are using the sound as a cue. They don't necessarily use the shape of the bell, the smell of the room, the color of the bell. It's somehow the sound. So that sound is not a stimulus per se, it's a construction of reality. These activate the schemes under minimal, so they're very minimal because the schemes are always trying to apply. We're active agents always trying to make sense. And then minimal cues intensify that self-propelling activity. And schemes apply together to overdetermine performance. So ultimately, schemes are co-activated and co-functional, and they inform experience and action. So an emotion scheme produces not a belief, but an experience or an action tendency. I'm not going to go into this, but this is a sort of a network depiction of a scheme. It has all different elements. Let's say I have a scheme of fear of failing an expectation in relation to my mother. I have many elements of that scheme. And then the final aspect is this experience is languaged into I'm going to fail an expectation. The belief I'm going to fail an expectation doesn't produce the experience. The belief is an articulation in language of a lived experience, which includes the visual image of my mother's face, my heart rate, my action tendency, and so on. So cognitive schemes provide truth appraisals. Is it true? Is it false? And then in cognitive therapy, belief has become the dominant concept, right? But essentially, they're about true or false, truth appraisals. Affects are about they produce feelings, and they're actually about value appraisals. Is it good for me? Is it bad for me? And we are not working with the cognitive, is it true or false? We're working with what information the emotion system is giving about whether it's good for me or bad for me. And then we've developed this notion, along with others, of an emotion scheme, which is really a synthesis of affect and cognition. Because there is some meaning making in emotion, but it's much more about, is it good for me or bad for me? So schemes carry expectancies about what should happen next based on what's happened before. So our emotion scheme has this intentionality in it that this is bad for me and this will happen. And when expectancies are violated by experience, there's a loss of organismic balance and we get affective arousal. So now, why dialectical constructivism? So constructivism minimizes the importance of associationistic learning, which is a passive empiricist concept. And it emphasizes much more the forming of models based on functional invariance. So things that have repeatedly occurred in my life, in my interaction or lived experience in the world, my patterns of coping with experience that increase adaptation and survival, we build structures of that. And then there's a complex schematic system, and dialectical constructivism involves the synthesis of a lot of schemes which combine together with other processes like attention and so on to finally construct a final performance. Now, I'm a student of Juan Pasqualeone, who was a student of Piaget's, right? And I mean, this theory of functioning comes from him. He's recently put out a book called The Working Mind. So this is just to try to give a sort of picture theory. It may not be totally coherent, but that the mind works based on schemes. Schemes have expectancies, they're future predicting. There's a dynamic process, and performance is produced by synthesizing schemes to produce a performance. Right? So this is all fairly high level abstraction. Right? I try to put this into a sort of pictorial model. So how does the self function? So firstly, we enter a situation and there is perception. This activates some very basic elements: neurochemical, limbic, glandular, physiological. I walk into the room, I see you, and depending on the relationship, I either tighten inside and hold my breath, or I feel warm and something happens in my body. This then activates my emotion schematic processing system, which is my lived experience of memories of connecting with enemy or with friend. And it activates a variety of emotion schemes, and there are already emotion schemes activated when I enter the room. I'm either agitated or calm when I come in. I'm anticipating good things or bad things. So there's a complex process, and these all synthesize. And we can construe these as a parliament of schemes. Right? Each scheme has a vote. And the votes may be of different strength, right? And then the majority vote wins. And that synthesis produces the self I find myself to be in a situation. We'll call this, I call it the operating self-organization. Damasio writes about the feeling of what happens, or Genelin writes about the felt referent of experience. There's some internal domain of complexity in which a lot of things are being synthesized below the level of consciousness, and I find myself to be in a certain state in a particular situation. By the synthesis of schemes and the voting of the parliament, right? So I find myself to feel a particular way. Now, if we can change the emotion scheme activation, we'll suddenly be able to generate another possible self-organization because the vote will change. I hope this is not too abstract, right? Let me give a concrete concrete sort of example. When I'm giving a lecture, right? Let's say, actually it happened this morning. My internet went down about an hour before this meeting. So I got agitated. So certain schemes of failure, of shame, of needing to be active in order to cope with this. I ran to my neighbors next door to see if I could piggyback on their internet. So when I enter this lecture, I've already got these activated schemes. I also had a good sleep last night, so that made me sort of calm beforehand. But then I had a number of anxiety-provoking activations. So then if somebody at this moment were to ask me a question coming from the participants, and I perceive this as a hostile question, right? I've now got 3 or 4 agitated schemes activated in me, one calm scheme from a good night's sleep. The hostile question, or perceived as hostile question, activates a threat, and suddenly I find myself organized as unsure, as feeling threatened. And I lose contact with my own ability to think clearly. My voice begins to become more tense because the Parliament of Schemes has determined that I am in a threat state. However, if I had a good sleep last night, I had good dreams, my partner this morning gave me a hug, I enter this with very positive kind of orientation. Then somebody asks me a question, which I perceive as hostile. It becomes part of the vote, but the dominant vote wins. And I find myself answering the question freely, in touch with my own meanings, not feeling threatened. So we are a dynamic self-organizing process, and we constantly are changing our state. And I'm 76 years old, but I never really know how I'm going to feel. So I'm never clear on what's going to happen. There's always a lot going on, and it depends on the situation, my pre-existing state, and so on. So this is the sort of picture theory I'm trying to build. So we now have all of this is our lived story. It's going on in us. There's a felt referent. But now the important thing is, do we pay attention to our felt experience, to the self I find myself to be? William James was the first to say, my experience is what I choose to attend to. So now we can attend to the feeling of what happens. And if we attend to the feeling of what happens, we generate our experiencing sense of self. We actually begin to experience what's happening. Then our experience that we're attending to interacts with symbolize. We begin to symbolize, and we generate explanations or understandings of what it is we feel and who we are right now. Now, where do explanations come from? Explanations come from culture, language, and mythology, right? So essentially, we live at the interface between biology and culture, between emotion and language, or emotion and reason. Social constructionists say we live in language, right? Bioevolutionary theorists say we are biologically determined. What I'm saying is we live at the interface. So everything is a dialectical process. The schemes are integrating. We integrate at that level. We integrate it with other internal processes. And then the conscious dialectic is between explanation and experience. And that comes from culture and biology, essentially. And then once we explain ourselves to ourselves or understand ourselves, we generate a belief or a self-representation, our view of ourselves. And even more complexly, we generate a narrative. Now, this all becomes the told story, right? So people come in with the told story. We can work at 3 levels with change. We can work at trying to change the narrative, but I see that as the most surface level of change. We can try to help people in their selective attention. Are they paying attention to their organismic system that's giving them information? And we can work at the deeper level of emotion schemes. Can we change the vote in the parliament of schemes so that people start organizing to become less threat prone or less abandonment prone, and so on? So the working mind has an active disposition to undergo reorganization spontaneously via dynamic syntheses in order to maximize internal consistency, adapt, and minimize internal complexity. Right? So this is a theory of the functioning of mind. Performance is synthesized by the currently most dominated activated cluster of compatible elements or schemes. The probability of any particular performance is proportional to the relative dominance of the current cluster of compatible schemes generating it relative to other competing clusters of schemes. So this is a theory that's attempting to provide a causal theory of the internal working of the mind, not a third-person objective description of you change your understanding of your object relationships, or you have an insight, or you change a belief. Those are external observers' descriptions. So I'm going to skip over this, but it's just highlighting that intention comes before language and is automatic. So now, based on this kind of theory, we want to look at therapy, and the proposal that I have been making over the last decade is that a fundamental principle is a principle of a corrective emotional experience that occurs by changing emotion with emotion. So I want to build up into this principle of changing emotion with emotion. So firstly, within EFT, we've developed a notion. There are 4 compasses which guide intervention. First, we've got to assess emotion moment by moment. Then we need principles of emotional change, and then an emotion-focused case formulation, and ultimately interventions, markers, and tasks. So the legs on which emotion-focused therapy stands in some way is assessment. There's primary emotions, the very first emotion I feel in a situation can be biologically adaptive. Fear organizes me for flight when there is threat. Secondary emotions are emotions that come second. They mask your primary emotions. They could defend against your primary emotions or be emotions about emotions. My anger can defend against my shame. or I can feel ashamed of being angry. Those are two different kinds of secondary emotions. One is a more protective, defensive, the other is a meta emotion. Then there's instrumental emotion, crying crocodile tears, being seductive. So an emotion is not just an emotion. When someone's sitting in front of me and they're crying, are they crying crocodile tears, trying to get my sympathy? Are their tears masking underlying anger? Or are their tears of grief? And finally, we want to get people to their primary emotions, but their primary emotions can be adaptive, or they can be reactions to the past in the present, maladaptive emotions. So my fear of abandonment or my sad loneliness now might actually not be adaptive to the current situation. They're based on post-traumatic learning. I'm going to skip over this because I see my time is running out. I'll come back to it. So intervention is we're trying to help people get to their primary emotions. Either their primary emotion is going to be adaptive and give them good information, or their primary emotion, like in post-traumatic stress disorder, your brain tells you that danger is present, but it isn't actually present. We're going to try to get you to your primary adaptive, maladaptive emotion, which is your core painful emotion. And we don't want to get to it because it gives you good information. We want to get to it in order to make it amenable to change. We also are interested in blocks. How are you blocking your emotion? So what kind of emotion is this? And how are you blocking your emotions, right? A quick overview of the therapy is we privilege the importance of the relationship, but then we also work on markers. People enter problematic states, which there's a marker of self-criticism, a marker of unfinished business. We're going to intervene in particularly different ways at different times. This intervention is going to produce a change process. This change process, if it's engaged in, will lead to an end state, a resolution state. So an overall picture of the therapy, we can think of their islands of work within an ocean of empathy. We work on self-criticism in a particular way. We work on unfinished business, we work on self-interruption, all in different ways. I hope I'm not rushing this too much. I'm aware of the book. I hope it's... So the therapy consists of relationship plus work, right? Islands of work in an ocean of empathy. And in the relationship, we combine following and guiding, right? So we're not only non-directive, we're also leading. We work in the proximal zone of development. We can lead a little bit, but not too far ahead. So I want to come now to some principles of emotional change. Our first principle is we want to increase emotional awareness. Most basically, we want to help people name what they're feeling, but it's not that simple. We really want to symbolize what we feel in the context of salient personal stories. So, and it's not just a matter of naming, I'm sad or I'm afraid. It's I'm afraid because my need for safety has not been met. This has occurred in this relationship for a long time. So it's always a complex narrative in which the feeling is embedded. But awareness is a very important principle. And emotions, rather than sitting fully formed in the unconscious, you know, I've sort of talked about the dialectical construction process. The emotion exists in an undifferentiated form, consisting of sensory motor schemes, pre-ideational, pre-verbal. Implicit emotional bodily felt sensation can be turned into conscious experience of a specific emotion by putting words on it, right? So that's what we're working to do, to bring this not yet formulated, not yet formed experience into a conscious experience of an emotion in a context of a narrative. There are two quotes from Spinoza that I love. He wrote early on, right, an emotion, which is a passion, and the word passion comes from passive and patient, where I'm passive in relation to what happens to me. When an emotion which is passive or passive in relation to it ceases to be passive as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea of it. So Spinoza argues when the mind knows a painful emotion, such as sadness or grief, is known, the activity of knowing signals an increase of power. We feel empowered. We become a sense of mastery of what's going on. And this generates a feeling of joy. So Spinoza is saying that putting emotion into words makes us agents in our lives, and that understanding is inherently joyful. And so this is the power of awareness of emotion. So I have a little clip here looking at working with this micro process.
But in you, it's more like that place. I'm wondering if you can ask yourself now almost, what seems most important, or what do I feel about that right now?
Probably I want to be understood.
Uh-huh.
And not that I want people to experience the pain that I've experienced, but I want them to understand.
Right. So see if you can.
So she is now working with a process of an internal focus, putting her attention into her body, to this internal domain of complexity, to try to start to make sense of what this feeling is. And her voice in this last moment, I want to be understood, shows you that she's working to create meaning, a felt meaning of this internal complexity. So this is one process we work with, trying to help you symbolize the feeling that is occurring inside, right? But then there's a second process. I'm working on principles of emotional change. The first principle is we want to help people access emotion. There are two aspects of this. One is focusing internally to symbolize. The other is expressing emotion, right? Now, expressing is different to awareness, and we have research which sort of looks at these issues, where expression predicts outcome, but awareness does not, indicating that there is a difference. So when you're expressing, firstly, these occur usually in virtual realities, in enactments, in chair work, or in imagery. People express, it's a form of doing. When you express, you actually overcome control and inhibition, their physiological and neurochemical changes. So expressing is a form of doing, and this evokes emotion. So when you say to your father in an empty chair, I hate you, or I love you, it's a different process to putting your eyeballs inwards and searching for what is it I feel, right? In expressing, we're doing something. It's not only an abstract talking about, but it's a body engagement. And why I think this is important and different is our brains automatically code what our body does. It's doing it all the time. I'm always coding, am I upright or am I slanted? If you touch me, it affects me deeply because my body is always coding what happens to my body, right? And as we do new things, our brain lays down new pathways. So when we express in a virtual reality, I deserve to be loved, we're actually beginning to lay down new experience, right? And that also evokes a whole lot of new emotion. So one of the things we want to do with emotion is we want to access it. We can access it through awareness processes or through expressive processes. Here is an example of an expressive process. It's hard to control my...
Imagine him here, if you will.
She's talking about difficulty with her husband, and she's in an...
I want to give up. I don't want to give. I want to give up on life. I'm tired.
Yeah, I'm so tired.
It's like I can't see anything worthwhile anymore.
I went too far ahead. I've got to go to... We've been talking about her dissatisfaction in the relationship or the unresolved bad feelings, and I put her in an empty chair diet.
Yeah, I want to give up. And when I want to give up, I don't want to give. I want to give up on.
For some reason, it's jumping forward. I'm trying to get the beginning.
And tell him how this makes you feel or what it impacts on you.
It's making me a miserable person. Not happy.
Yeah, tell him about it. I'm not happy.
I'm not happy.
Yeah. Breathe and just let, these are important tears. It's okay. Tell him about, what are the tears saying?
Can't you see I'm hurt?
I feel so hurt.
I feel extremely hurt.
Yeah.
I'm tired.
Yeah.
So this is a remarkable process. That's the first time I've put her in an empty chair dialogue. We've been talking about it for 30 minutes, or 17 minutes actually, I think. And then we put her in direct contact and she talks to him. And then that really activates the emotion, right? And it's a different process to the one previously where you turn your eyeballs inwards and search. So we now have 3 types of intervention. We can engage dialogically, talking to the other, conveying our empathic understanding and putting words on emotion. Right? We can guide people's attention to their emotion, or we can stimulate their emotion by more active expressive means. Right? So we're always being empathically attuned moment to moment. Our finger is on a person's emotional pulse. What are you feeling right now? We use empathic exploration. We use empathic conjecture, guessing, but always in their zone of proximal development. When words and talking aren't enough, we guide attention using things like Gendlin's focusing. They're measures we use to measure the processes that these kinds of interventions facilitate. The experiencing scale. At level 4, there's a marked shift inwards with a focus on exploration of internal feelings. There's a vocal quality scale. There's a focused voice where the person speaks. It's like their eyeballs are turned inwards and they're making meaning from their internal experience, as opposed to a lecturing at voice where they're talking at you. But then there are chair interventions and imagery, and these activate. We developed another scale, an emotional arousal scale, where at level 5, the arousal is fairly intense in voice and body. The speech patterns deviate. So this is a different process. They're both important processes, deepening experience and activating arousal. But arousal alone is not enough. So we developed a scale of productive processing of aroused emotion. Basically, you need to be contactfully or mindfully aware of your emotion in order for it to be therapeutically productive. There are 6 elements of this scale. You have to attend to what's happening in your body. You have to symbolize it. Your expression has to be congruent with your symbolization. You have to accept your emotion rather than evaluate it as bad. You have to feel yourself to be an agent of your emotion. You have to have the emotion regulated. It's got to be within your zone of tolerance. And you have to be differentiating the emotion, which is the most complex process. If you're doing all these things with aroused emotion, it's going to be therapeutically productive. So I want to end up by talking about transformation. So change involves accepting emotions and processing them, but it also involves transformation. So we really have to work with acceptance and change. And you can't change yourself till you've accepted who you are. So you have to feel an emotion to make it amenable to new input. So therapists have to help clients arrive at emotion. They need to approach, become aware, they need to allow and accept, and they need to symbolize. So a major premise guiding intervention is we want to arrive at emotion. You have to feel something to heal something. You can't leave a place until you've arrived at it. But we also want transformation. More is needed. Something needs to change, not just acceptance. We need to help people not only accept, but also change. So we need to leave emotion once we've arrived at it. So we're going to transform that which is maladaptive by generating alternate adaptive emotional responses. We're going to go through a transformation process. We're not talking here about symptom change. We're talking about changing your internal structure. So when can we change emotion with emotion? What's the marker? Well, when the client arrives at a core, painful, primary maladaptive emotion at moderate to high arousal, this is the time to try to help them arrive at a new emotion to change the old emotion. We have found that the primary painful maladaptive emotions are fear type 1, and this is the attachment-related fear where when you feel afraid, you want to run to the cueing situation. Or fear type 2, which is traumatic fear where you want to run away from, there's danger and you want to get away. But the core painful feeling that's very fundamental is fear, either fear type 1 or type 2. Then there's primary sadness of lonely abandonment. Here you feel like a child crying out for somebody to come and no one comes. You're abandoned and alone. And then there's the primary shame of worthlessness. I'm defective, I'm no good. So when people have entered into this state, it's alive in the room. There's moderate to high arousal. This is now an opportunity. You're going to symbolize, you're going to arrive at this, you're going to differentiate it, but ultimately you want to change it. And how do you change? You change emotion from another emotion. The new emotion can come from within or from a new interpersonal experience with the therapist. So Spinoza, again, gives us a quote. He was the first to state this principle. An emotion cannot be restrained nor removed unless by an opposed and stronger emotion. So we now start thinking about how do we change fear with anger? Can we change anger with sadness? Can we change shame with self-compassion? How do we evoke a new emotion to change an old emotion? So basically what we've shown is that the core maladaptive emotions are sadness, fear, and shame. We want to transform them. And we found that they transformed by accessing adaptive emotions of empowered anger, of the sadness of grief, which differs from the sadness of lonely abandonment. The grief, you're grieving for what you missed and lost. You're not talking about feeling alone and abandoned. And compassion, compassion for the self. So, drawing on Piagetian thinking, I'm talking about transformation, not completion, essentially. Old theories of emotional change were that you feel a feeling and it goes away. The first theory was catharsis, you get rid of the emotion. Then there were completion theories, you complete the processing. Buddhist detachment theories, you sit by the river and you let it, observe it go by. It arises and passes away. Behavioral theories, where you habituate to the emotion or you extinguish the emotion. What I'm talking about is transformation by synthesis. We change emotion with an emotion. We have a yellow emotion, shame. We bring in a blue emotion, say adaptable, empowered anger. The blue emotion undoes the yellow emotion. It blends with it. It synthesizes it in a dialectical synthesis. It generates a novel, new emotional state in a new synthesis, and we get a green emotion of confidence, of calm, of strength. So we're changing an emotion with an emotion. We're not replacing one emotion with another. We're transforming one emotion with another. Support for this, and I'll end after this, comes from research on memory and memory reconsolidation, right? So the old theory of memory was there's an event, we encode it, consolidate it, and it becomes a fixed memory. Then we reactivate the memory, we remember something, it goes back into memory because it's fixed. It's been shown that that's not really the case. When you reactivate a memory, it becomes labile. It's open, it's unfixed. If in the context of activating an old memory, let's say we activate the feeling of shame in relation to an abusive father, then if we can, in the present reality, generate a new feeling, like a feeling of empowered anger, of feeling angry at the unfairness of having been so threatened all one's life, this new experience has a probability of being reconsolidated into the memory. The memory reconsolidates, assimilating the new experience, and we get a transformed memory. So now when I think of my father, my body doesn't automatically react with shrinking and with tightening in the stomach, but I react with a more agentic or more confident body stance, a stronger feeling, and a new narrative of it's not me who was bad, it was you who was dysfunctional. I think I will end there.
Thank you so much.
Right.
Kurt Lewin had this phrase, there's nothing as practical as a good theory. I think we've just heard a good theory. Really, so much of what we have out there, cognitive behavioral therapy, various techniques for therapy, for teaching, for educating, for parenting, they're all isolated so often. We grab onto a technique and we use it. But what we have here is a way of thinking, it seems to me. And armed with a way of thinking, we can figure out what we need to do in our relationship. So I think that this was a lovely, wonderful, wonderful. Whoever's got the little children, can we put them in a box or something like that? I'm going to have to.
Or put yourself on mute, right?
Yes, put yourself on mute. Thank you so much.
So, Parliament of schemes for a minute.
So let's please have some questions. What I'm going to do is try to get you all on my screen.
Right. I'm putting you on gallery view.
Okay, and if you'd be so kind as to simply raise your hand, and I will go around and call on you, and you can ask a question. If you feel the need, you can put it into the chat. But let's see if we can do this live, if you would. So I invite you to ask questions, make comments for our speaker. Who'd like to begin?
I see Antonio.
Antonio, please. Oh, I'm sorry. You all have the capacity to raise your hands symbolically with a yellow hand, which will make me see it. It's under reactions, but you could also raise your hand, but it'd be easier for me to see if you. So Antonio, please.
Yes, Professor Greenberg, thank you very much for such a wonderful talk. It's early in the morning in my country, the Philippines. Talk a lot, but I'm wide awake, unlike before. I was sleepy, but this time, your whole narrative, I might say it's a grand narrative, the way Jim Mancuso appeared to me when he hosted my Fulbright senior scholar grant for advanced research, and up to May 1999. Well, it's very emotional period in my life when I met him. Actually, he inspired me when he woke up to my first paper on personal construct theory in Wollongong.
Sorry, Antonio. Antonio, I missed. Yes? Who are you talking about? Who did you?
I'm talking about James Carmine Mancuso of University of Albany at the time. I think it's a second generation Kellyan, having met George Kelly. They have pictured together, as I remember. What was he into at the time? At the time I met him, he was into already into narrative psychology. I think that was a turn, the narrative turn in the social sciences as well as in psychology. Anyway, to cut the story short, the thing that hit me at the time was when they have no place for me yet. They were surprised Mancuso was already retired at that time. He was Professor Emeritus. Anyway, the apparent motion experiment is the first thing that I remember he showed me. In fact, he showed me an article, and then I started looking at it, where you have these two light. I think the gap within which you see that there is a jumping from the first spark of light to the next is when it's between 150 milliseconds. Slower or faster than that, well, you don't see that. So that's I think this is basically the reason for why we see film, which are just still pictures put all together in a string. I think he was trying to demonstrate that at the very start, we are already structured. We already have the structure for a narrative. Well, I'm thinking about last lecture from the university professor from Finland. How far can you go, and what visual stimuli, if you might, give the neonate. I was thinking if you can only do that, and there is already a perception, an ability to sense the light, for example, in the neonate is active within the third trimester.
Antonio, you're fading in and out, at least in my thing. I'm having difficulty understanding you. I think what you're saying, because I knew Jim, I think what you're saying is that the phi phenomenon, when you show one light and then another light, it seems to jump.
Yes,
that's so natural. I think what you're saying is that sets up, that's like an immediate, almost biological disposition toward a narrative.
Yes,
There's your first narrative. Right. It sounds like that's what you're saying.
You work with, I don't know, remember, you worked with Jim Mancuso, right?
Yes. So
you worked with Jim.
Yeah.
So you were with Jim at some point.
Yes. So Dr. Greenberg, do you want to respond to that in any way?
Well, I think it just highlights that that's a fundamental meaning-making system, and that's the meaning-making system that's not affective, right? It's the cognitive aspect of our fundamental processes. Yeah, it's important. And I'm saying there's also another system, which is an affect system, which would be evaluating, not in that case, is it good for me or bad for me? But both of them are very important. Thank you.
Someone else, please. I don't want you to get your name wrong. Shanez?
That's me. Hello. Hi. Thank you for your wonderful talk. It's something, I guess, what I'm really hearing is it's not just a thinking theory that you're talking about. It is very much a feeling theory as well. And what I'm picking up, it's if we are to be, even as therapists, if we are to be with our experience, we have to be in being with our experience. So listening to you and watching the video, there's something here about having, as a therapist as well as a person, to have the courage to be with the client and not go into the cognitive piece. So there's a construing that is happening at two levels, in the here and now, and embracing all of what that means. And then there is the piece around the cognitive. And I'm wondering about your use of the words dialectical constructivism. And I've thought about and felt my way through that a lot myself. There's something here that sometimes the cognitive and the affect, the feeling of being with, can be quite opposing in some ways. The construction of what is happening, the primary, the secondary emotion. I'm wondering what you make of that the use of the word dialectical and constructivism affect and emotion is what I'm interested in.
Right, okay. Yeah, I mean, I skipped over some slides, talking about the therapy, but the therapist has to be really present. We've written a book on therapeutic presence, right? And, to be able to tolerate and sit with someone in their emotional pain is not easy.
No.
And young therapists, out of maybe good intentions, want to help. But you actually have to have the ability to sit with that pain and differentiate and make sense of it. And in order to do that, one has to be emotionally processed yourself. So it's not just a theory of learning techniques and theories, but it's actually a personal development of the therapist, right? So one has to go through one's own emotional process in order to be able to really be present with someone else. But the second point you've raised, I've never really thought of my use of dialectical constructivism, is based on the sort of notion that there is a there. I'm pointing to my chest, right? There's a feeling of internal complexity that's there, but it's not yet fully formed. So it's not like my anger sits inside of me fully formed, but there is something there that can be constructed into I'm angry at you, so that there's the dialectic is between the felt bodily sense and the meaning-making language. But you're highlighting the sort of I-thou encounter, I think. And you're saying there's a dialectic between I and thou, or between us, where you're kind of contacting two different realities, in fact, two different subjectivities, and that it's the interaction of those two that's important. So I thank you for that idea. I mean, I haven't really thought about it, but yeah, I do think that everything comes from this interaction of pre-existing elements into the development of something new.
Wonderful.
Right.
Guillaume?
Yes, thank you for this wonderful presentation, very synthetic. I heard other presentations from you in years in the past, and I can see a lot of enrichment and evolution in your thought, which I really appreciate. I just wanted to point to one particular aspect. In the first clip, we could see a woman who was crying while talking about something about her degree, which has probably nothing to do with the crying, right? So you pointed to what the tears were telling, which I think it's a very good therapeutic work. But what I am thinking here, my point here, is that the tears were also a manifestation of meaning. It was the emotional scheme driving the tears is not something separated from meaning. It's probably separated from her thought processes, but not from the internal meaning structure. So if we consider those tears as something related to an emotional schema, we must also say that that emotional schema is related to a meaning, which then she is able to elaborate upon after your question. So for me, in that episode, what we have is we have an internal conflict of two sub-meaning systems. The meaning system driving to the tear, and the meaning system driving to talking about her bachelor degree or something I could not understand very well, but I understood it was very unrelated. So these conflicts that appear to us as non-verbal emotional expression and a very different verbal intellectual expression, in fact, are not a conflict between emotion and cognition, but a conflict between two different parts of the meaning system, which are not well harmonized, which are in internal conflict. This is my view.
Yeah, no, I agree totally with your observation that an emotion scheme contains meaning. It's our fundamental processing system. But what I'm talking about is in therapy, we're trying to bring the verbal narrative system in line to be congruent with the emotion system, which itself has meaning. But the problem is her conscious narrative system. Let's just say in therapy, somebody comes in and they start telling you their theory of life, right? This is a meaning system, but it's not in touch with the actual core experiential system. But the experiential system contains affect and meaning. So I'm not sort of saying the meaning system is in conflict with the tears there. I'm just saying, look, here's a narrative system that so often, like Shanaz said, you can sort of get caught up in the cognitive thinking about with people, but we've got to pay attention to making meaning of the core organismic feeling, which is a dialectical synthesis of emotion and meaning always, but is it conscious or is it just there? So
it seems
I don't know if that clarifies. Yeah,
it seems to me that building on what Gilliam is saying, that there's a higher order meaning perhaps and a lower order meaning that is going on. I noticed that when you were talking about emotion, that you would also often talk about emotion and feeling. It almost felt to me, there's some feedback going on, I don't know why. It almost felt to me kind of like what Gilliam was suggesting, that a disconnect between the feeling and the meaning. But it seems to me that emotions are reactions to what I care about. They're reactions to the fate of my motives. An emotion, it seems to me, is a felt way of relating to the world. It's not just the feeling. It carries along with it the way of relating to the world. And there's the meaning right there. And it strikes me that what you're doing is, the emotion is a marker for that whole way of relating, and you're trying to bring the narrative linguistic system in contact with that so that it could be represented. Yes, would that be a fair way to describe it?
Yes, definitely. So, this issue of feeling versus emotion versus affect, right? So, I mean, it may not, I didn't draw it out, but what I've said is there's a cognitive scheme, there's an affective scheme, and then there's an emotion scheme. And actually the emotion scheme is an integration of cognition and affect, right? So, affect is the whole physiological, Damasio writes with the image of a tree that you can think of affect as the roots and the main trunk of the tree. You can think of emotion as the main branches, anger, sadness, fear, and shame. And then feelings are the more socially differentiated emotions. So I use the words undisciplinedly because we don't really know. But, when we're working with a person, we're generally talking about feelings. And these feelings are these complex syntheses of affect and cognition and social differentiation, right? So that actually the emotion scheme is not just pure affect. It is this kind of complex, situated, relational felt meaning. I don't know if that's too many words, but it's what you said, Michael.
I make a
please, Harry.
Harry, yeah.
I'm just, it's incredibly impressive. There's, there's a lifetime of thoughts and integration gone into this model. But what I'm trying to do at the moment is to say, well, what's the main difference between the way I practice, which is, you know, from PCP and from systemic therapy. That's my sort of main influences. What's the main difference between what you're outlining and what the way I'm thinking of practice? And I mean, one of my main feelings is that, to me, in the therapy situation, I want to be filling my head with the client's situation, with their relationships, with their family situation, with where they're at, what they want to achieve, what they're suffering. I don't want to have too many sort of theoretical thoughts in my mind. I don't. If I feel them, if the construct that's in my mind is emotion versus cognition, for instance, or all these, I mean, incredibly important theoretical constructs, but I want to forget all that in a way and get into my client's world and listen to her her constructs, basically. But that's another sort of abstraction, isn't it? Literally into the content of her of the meanings that she's making, of the feelings, meanings, and situation. Because I think, in a way, therapeutic change, when a person comes to therapy and they feel that they can sort of put their stuff on the table and that it's accepted and listened to, change sort of happens. If you like, it goes back to a sort of Rogerian sort of, you know, if the client can sort of get in touch with her own stuff, because I'm with her, I don't want to have too many expert sort of thoughts in my head. You know, I'm not saying that when you're practicing you do, but to me, there's such a huge theoretical overlay here. You know, you're mentioning the brain and the amygdala and the processes and the systems and the systems. I want my head just to be mainly thinking about this unique person's story and their situation. And I believe that if I'm in touch with that, somehow or other, there'll be a dialectic between us that will actually move things on. And it's not to say that my way of thinking is better. It's just I wanted to try and express that main difference.
Yeah. But I mean, you know, I agree with you totally. This is a theoretical, as you know, and there's nothing as good as it. I mean, what Michael said, you know, a theory, but so it's an attempt to explain, and it comes from that need to have a meaning by explaining what's going on. But
do we need to explain? To me, I would say we need to understand. I'm not sure about the word explain being as important as psychology has made it to be. You know?
Well, what I'm trying to say, and I haven't been very articulate, is practice is very different to theory, right? So I agree with you totally. When I'm practicing, I mean, all this is not in my head and is not really of value to me. I'm trying to tune in. The only thing I would say from what you were saying, I mean, my base is client-centered and Rogerian, but I'm going to tune into the affective tone, not so much to the verbal content, right? So it's like, you know, even as you're talking to me, it's like, what's your voice like? How much anxious, or what's it feel like to be you saying this? That's what I'm trying to tune into, right? And I think that's what you're talking about. But then I'm an academic. I believe that theory is helpful. The experiential movement, the humanistic experiential movement, which I came out of, failed because it didn't have a theory, a coherent theory. And then it kind of fails because it becomes esoteric. You've got to experience it to know it, but who cares how you explain it? So I do think explanation helps, but it doesn't help me in the moment in the therapy room. But that's not what's filling my head. But it does in the long run. I mean, I started off totally non-directively. But then in thinking about it, in doing research and in trying to understand and explain, I moved to this combination of following plus guiding. And that leap was helped by my theoretical understanding of what I'm trying to do. But anyhow, I appreciate your comment. I understand.
Thank you.
Hey, we are at 1:30. I want to respect everyone's time and Dr. Greenberg's time. If I may ask Keith to ask his question very quickly, and we'll get it. Hopefully, we'll get there'll be enough time for a response. Keith.
Thank you. I will be brief. I was really just going to add to what just hearing with a metaphor that I really like for practice, which is from music, which is from jazz. Jazz musicians extemporize, they improvise. They do so because somewhere, not in the front of their awareness, but in their training and their discipline, know a hell of a lot about the nature of music and musical theory and musical structures. They also know, best ones, how to kind of break the rules while still following them. But I think there's something quite useful for me in that you have theory not because you're hitting people over the head with it, because it's somewhere there in the background to inform what you do and to reflect afterwards on. So I just wanted to throw that in as a kind of metaphor.
Sure.
I happen to be a musician as well, but a very good jazz musician. But I kind of like that kind of way of looking at it. So just I was going to say.
Yeah, I think that's helpful.
Very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Greenberg, for being here. It was very stimulating and engaging for me. I'm sure for everyone else. Harry, did you want to say anything?
Would you like to just say, Mike, that next time we've got Ezekiel Di Paolo, another very eminent person, and we want lots of people to attend. Do you want to just say a couple of words about that?
Yes, Di Paolo's work comes from something that might be called an activism, which he calls an activism. And I tell you, whenever it's if you will, it's a kind of a synthesis of dynamic systems theory, phenomenology, and embodiment. I think it's very good stuff, and I think it's kind of a wave of the future. And I just know that when I've attended talks with him and his colleagues, I can recognize humanity in it, and that's quite big. So I hope we can get some people there.
Can you just repeat his name? I'd like to look him up. Yeah.
I'm going to fail to, because I always
Di Paolo.
Di Paolo. I always
have a look at the website. We've got each talk with.
Okay.
You'll be up there soon too.
Okay.
Yeah, the video will be up in a couple of days, weeks maybe. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thanks everybody, and thank you particularly.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Bye.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Be well.
Hi, Antonio. Thanks for your question.
Thank you very much. Wonderful night.
Thank you. I'll turn the recording off, Mike.
Thank you for reminding me.